Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Body of Lies, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Russell Crowe, Mark Strong. Let me see if I say this name right. Gosifete Farahani, forgive me if I said that wrong, and Oscar Isaac, directed by Ridley Scott. Now, I went briefly to theaters for this, and I remember this not being the best thing I've seen. So this will be my first two viewings after that theatrical viewing that I walked out after, I forget, like 10 minutes. So let's get into the movie. The movie opens in Manchester, England. We get some terrorists film their message of where their next attack is at, while government agents come in the building as it blows up. And this opener was intense. Meanwhile, somewhere in Iraq, we meet with the main character, Roger Ferris, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, on a mission for his boss, Ed Hoffman, played by Russell Crowe, and the CIA, as Roger is picked up by Bassam, played by Oscar Isaac, and discuss the plan and meet with the terrorist named Nazar. And the characters are not the greatest for a Ridley Scott film, as I could live without them, but the cinematography is once again pretty to look at. Roger asks Nazar for some information, and Nazar tells Roger as Roger calls Ed and sees a live video from the terrorist as Nazar wants to come to America without any harm coming to him, and they have to ask him some questions. Meanwhile, in Langley, Virginia, in the CIA headquarters, they watch Roger and Bassam and Nazar are on the ground, and Nazar is almost taken until Roger shoots him dead and calls Ed to tell him he has to do it. And while he didn't see a team down there, and they go on a suicide mission. And remind me, other than being in the war with Iraq, what the fuck is the plot of this movie? As the action is a pretty unspectacular in my opinion. Roger and Bassam get in a chase with the terrorists as Roger's car was flipped upside down, and they get Roger, but they leave Bassam behind as Oscar Isaac felt wasted in this movie, and Roger ends up at the hospital where the military base is at, and he recovers as he gets a call from Ed and goes on a different mission from Amman, Jordan, and Roger whines about how he needs internet to take a dump in the shower, which really made me laugh, as this has nothing to do with the fucking movie, as Roger has a meeting with some men and tells the boss of the building to leave the company building, as Roger is in charge. And I don't care for any of this, as the problem I'm having is with this movie is it drags, which feels sad for a 2 hour and 8 minute movie, as it's a little bit too long. Roger meets with Hani, played by Mark Strong, and Ed takes over the company that Roger is in, as he spies on someone who is a terrorist while he runs off, and they get in a backyard with two dogs, and they bite his leg and stabs one of the dogs. Once he gets out of there and goes to a hospital where a nurse named Aisha, played by, let me see if I said the name right, Gosif Farhani, something like that. I forget if I said the name right. Please forgive me. Heals him once again, calls Ed as well as Hani, and this movie is going absolutely nowhere, as I'm getting a little impatient with as this point. Hani takes Roger to a room where they whip him, one of the terrorists, and we move on to Amsterdam, Netherlands, and a guy on a bicycle gets a note of a code of some kind, and suddenly a building blows up, and why the fuck should I care for any of this shit at all, as it goes nowhere? While Roger goes in the middle of nowhere, and Hani to visit Mustafa Karami, and gives him a phone to call his mother and lets him live, and takes his bicycle with him, and Roger tells Ed it's fucking bad, while Hani doesn't trust Ed, and Ed ends up at Roger's apartment. And this movie isn't fun nor entertaining to me, as it's one of the Ridley Scott's weakest movies as far as my liking his work, in my opinion, goes. Roger, Ed, and Hani meet with, and Ed and Hani get into an intense conversation after Ed asks Hani to take control of his company and wants Karami and says too fucking bad, as Ed says do not trust Hani, and Karami almost gets captured, but he gets away. Roger goes to the hospital to visit Aisha, and asks her out on a date, and they go outside, and I'm thinking to myself, is this a love story between Aisha and Roger, or is this a movie about the CIA against the terrorists in Iraq? As I'm an hour into it and don't know what the fuck the plot is, as this movie is plotless. That's part of the reason why I walked out of Garfield earlier this year, for Christ's sakes. Roger is taken to Hani and asks him if he knows anything, as Hani doesn't believe him when Roger says no, and Roger gets back to Washington, D.C. and has a rough conversation with Ed about how power hungry he is, and Ed sends Roger to Garland at his house in a different country and hears him about his ninjas working for him and learns about Omar Siddiqui, and my head is restless, as this is a good sleepy kind of movie, but not as a good movie to watch, as I can't follow what the hell's going on in this movie. Roger is hacking a computer with Garland and gets what they want and go back to Amman to see Hobby, and afterhand sees Aisha and her sister wants to meet Roger and approve of him, squeeze me very much, and they meet after the hospital scene and they have lunch together, and I'm going crazy. Like, I don't know what the fuck's happening at all. And the lunch scene is the awkward for damn sure. Hani shows Roger a photograph of Omar Siddiqui, and Hani asks Roger to keep the photograph to give to Garland. And we move on in, let me see if I'm saying this word right, Incirlik, Turkey? Yeah, that's the name of the place, in Turkey. Incirlik. Roger arranges a meeting with Omar Siddiqui as they blow up a building while Roger and Hani watches it on the news on the TV, and Roger gives the last piece of information to Garland, and Omar gets death threats, and this movie is slowing way the fuck down. Ed congratulates Roger as Roger decides to bring Omar to a safe place and tries to get him, but people are chasing after him and is unfortunately captured by some terrorists, and Omar blames the Americans for what reason? I don't fucking know. And Omar gets killed, and Ed calls Roger and decides he can't be in the CIA anymore, and he's exposed with Aisha and breaks into her sister's place, and he sees blood, and he visits Hani and tells him he lied to his face, and Hani doesn't forgive him for lying to him big time, and at this point, I just don't care, as once again, one of Ridley Scott's weakest movies. Roger tries to call Aisha, but she's kidnapped by some terrorists and is told to come to where they have her at, which is in Syria in the middle of the desert. And Roger gets dropped off and waits until eventually a car comes to where he's at and picks him up and takes him in a blindfold to a jail cell led by terrorists who knows he's in the CIA, and they interrogate and torture him, and the movie is falling apart, and I'm getting sleepy and impatient at this point. The terrorists cut Roger loose until some CIA agents kill the terrorists and save Roger's life, and he wakes up at the hospital, and Hani visits him in the hospital, as it was Hani's men who picked him up and left the desert and didn't hurt Aisha, as he has to earn her respect again, and Roger quits Ed and the CIA and stays in Amman for a while to see Aisha as the hospital while locking up buying some vegetables, and Ed says to the CIA to not spy on him no more, and the climax was falling apart as the movie was fine, but I'll explain why in a rating. I'll give this movie a 5.1 out of 10. The cinematography is pretty to look at, as the characters are not the greatest for a Ridley Scott film, as I could live without them characters, and is this a movie about terrorists in Iraq, or is this a love story between DiCaprio and the girl, as this felt plotless? And the action in this movie is pretty unspectacular. The sad thing is, this kind of drags, as it's a little bit too long of a movie at 2 hours and 8 minutes, as I got impatient with it, as it absolutely goes fucking nowhere. And I don't care about any of the shit going on in this movie, as I don't know why I should care at all. This may be one of the weakest movies Ridley Scott has made, as this felt like a good movie to fall asleep on instead of watching, as I'm giving it a mild recommendation, as it's like I said, plotless, and I've seen movies that are plotless that are better than this movie, not Garfield by any means necessary, but at the end of the day, it's a fine movie. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with Robin Hood, the 2010 version directed by Ridley Scott and starring Russell Crowe. And until then, am I quite finished?